I want to talk about how to reimagine bubble maps so that our students are thinking more critically while they use them. If you look for bubble maps on the internet, they are everywhere. And all these bubble maps have one thing in common, and that is that they have a preset number of circles. So what does a preset number of circles do? It really limits our students' thinking because they know how many answers to look for. If there's four bubbles, I'm just going to look for where there's four of something. So let's talk about what a bubble map can look like, right? So bubble maps can look much more robust than we tend to see the templates being. And that allows students to truly organize and categorize concepts related to a topic. So how do we get this type of bubble map from students who are used to the four circles or the six circles? How do we start students with basically a blank page, right? How do we start students with one circle and get that slide that I just showed you? We first need to talk to students about what is the purpose of a bubble map. So if the purpose of a bubble map is to organize and categorize concepts within a topic, how do we ensure that that's what students are doing? We do that by providing directions. We're not used to providing directions for bubble maps because in the past, students knew if there's a circle, I need to put something in the circle. But now that there's no circle, I need to give students a little bit more details, right? So how do you make up a list of directions that take students from that center circle to adding circles along the way? The other thing you're going to see in these directions is really about talking about the relationship between the different concepts and topics, or what's in the circles. And what I did in this slide is I showed where you can label the arrows to talk about the relationship between the two circles. And this allows our students to dive deeper into what they're putting on the paper. For instance, if I'm looking at the acute angle and I see a pizza slice, what does a pizza slice have to do with an acute angle? Oh, it's an example of it. So some of our students are doing this naturally in their heads, but we also know that some of our students are putting things in the circle, but they're not really sure how it ties into the bigger circle. So how do we do that? We can provide tips for not only writing the circles, right? If we're going to give them all the circles, we need to help them understand what could fit in there. But we also can give our students tips for explaining the relationship between the circles. So if we're going to ask our students to start with a blank page, we need to help lighten the cognitive load. And in the past, we've lightened the cognitive load by just limiting the number of circles. But let's instead limit the cognitive load by giving them more detailed directions so that they know what to do with that blank page. Along with directions for students, let's think out, what does planning entail? Planning with a blank page in mind doesn't actually have any more details, any more steps than a regular bubble map does, right? You need to identify the learning intentions. You need to identify the resources or notes that students will use in order to complete their bubble map. We don't want this all straight from their head because we're not asking kids to memorize, we're asking kids to analyze, and that's a big difference. And then the third step is, how do you provide some mini deadlines so you can check in with them along the way to make sure that they're on the right track, that they're getting any support they need. Maybe you need to point out another resource. The other thing to think about is, how do you get kids started, right? So some tips for getting started with this new type of bubble map, really ensuring that you're showing some examples, that you're being specific on where they can find the information, that you're ensuring that all the notes have the right information so they're making connections and not just memorizing facts. And then, of course, setting those mini deadlines. Some things to avoid: try to avoid telling your students how many circles to draw or back to the previous problem. Also, especially in the beginning, don't overcomplicate the maps by adding squares or other shapes. In the beginning, students just need to understand that they're showing connections, they're categorizing, they're organizing, not creating different shapes for different things. If they choose to do that, I wouldn't count it against them, but I wouldn't ask them to do it either. And then, of course, if we're looking at this as much more as a task at the analysis level, instead of what was recall or comprehension, right, we're having them analyze the relationship and the categories and organizations of concepts, then we can do some extensions, right? We can get peer feedback from each other because they're going to have different maps and it's going to look different from each other. This is a great opportunity for peer feedback. And then we can also have our students use their bubble map as a planning tool to write a paragraph or an essay or even a presentation. So as we're thinking about bubble maps in this new way and the power of the blank page of a bubble map, thinking in terms of the goal is critical thinking, the goal is having students analyze, the goal is having students organize and categorize for themselves, and how do you lighten the load of everything else, staying focused on that purpose?